What is news? Have you ever asked yourself this question? Today we're going to look at what makes news, news, and the role that your audience plays in determining what you write about and ultimately what gets printed in your newspaper or online. David Brinkley used to say, "News is what I say it is," and in a way, he was right. Every day what we see as news is determined by journalists and editors exercising news judgment. News judgment decides not only what is included in the news, but what is included as part of the news. It's the process of determining what stories and visuals will be interesting to the readers or the audience of a specific news outlet, how much of the stories and its components will be used, when, and where. Factors that influence news judgment include demographics and culture of the audience, what the competition is doing, so if a competing radio, TV, or news outlet's covering a story, should you be covering it too? Is there a different angle you can take on the issue or problem? And last but not least, the station's or publication's values. Does it skew liberal? Is it conservative? What is likely to be the angle the publication takes on any issue or problem? Now, what I find interesting is probably slightly different than what you find interesting. And what you find interesting is probably different than what someone in Nashville wants to know about. No matter, to qualify as news, it usually contains at least one of these values, and often it will contain more than one. Whenever you're thinking about writing a story, ask yourself if any of these values apply. Will it matter to my readers? Will it have an effect on their lives in some way? The bigger the consequences, the bigger the story becomes. Has it just happened? Is it about to happen? Timeliness is crucial, especially when you're competing against other news outlets. Is it local? Local events will usually matter more to readers than events in other cities, states, or countries. But remember, there are exceptions. Does it involve a well-known public figure or celebrity? The more recognizable the name, the more readers will want to know. Is it something new, odd, or surprising? The stereotypical example of this is when a dog bites a man, it's not news. But when a man bites a dog, it's news. Is there any type of conflict? And this can be any conflict: political rivalry, sports rivalry, a power struggle, and of course, true conflict or war. And finally, does the story elicit emotion from your readers? Does it make them happy, sad, angry? People respond to human interest stories that are comical, motivational, or sad. News values are covered in your textbook on page 19. Let's look at news judgment in action. Here are 3 Tennessee daily newspaper front pages from the same Monday in August. The Commercial Appeal from Memphis, the News Sentinel from Knoxville, and the Tennessean in Nashville. What stories, if any, did all 3 newspapers run on the front page? What images did they choose to use on the front page? Remember that the placement of news stories on the front page is very telling. We'll talk more about this in a different lecture, but basically, the bigger the headline, the more prominent the position, and the use of images or other graphics with the story tells the reader what the editors think is the most important news of the day. Now, all 3 of the papers ran a story on power abuse in Tennessee government. The Tennessean is the state's capital newspaper. They featured the story so prominently that they even used their banner as part of the graphics. The Commercial Appeal and News Sentinel both gave the story prominent placement at the top of the page, but neither of these newspapers have the story as their centerpiece, or lead. Also notice the different placement and extent of coverage each paper gave to the closing ceremonies of the Olympics. Now, we saw how the coverage of the news varies within the state of Tennessee on any given day. Let's look now at 3 California daily newspapers from that same Monday in August. Here's the LA Times, the San Diego Union Tribune, and the San Francisco Chronicle. Now, you don't see any mention of the political struggles in Tennessee. You do see the Olympic closing ceremonies covered fairly prominently in all 3 papers. What other differences do you see in the coverage of these 3 prominent West Coast papers? If you enjoy looking at newspaper front pages to see how stories are covered not only from state to state, but also in different countries, check out the Newseum's website at www.newseum.org. And we've talked about how journalists and editors exercise news judgment and use news values to decide what is news. But let's look at news from our reader's perspective. We all consume the news in different ways. How do we, journalists and editors, determine what our readers want to read? Do they want serious issues, light issues, short or long form, words or pictures, online or traditional print? To understand the kind of information your readers want to know, you have to understand your audience. The Pew Research Center conducts public opinion polling, demographic research, content analysis, and other data-driven social science research in many different areas, including journalism and media. One of their 2015 studies looked at what news Americans pay attention to. They found that fewer Americans are paying attention to in-depth news. How does this information help you determine what stories to cover? Does this mean you cover hard news? Or do you not cover hard news? Could this change the way you cover important news stories? You also need to know where your audience gets its information. Since we're talking about print news or newspapers in this class, we'll focus on that column. Again, from the Pew Research Center, we know that Americans typically turn to the newspaper for information and news about their local town or city, arts and culture, and schools and education. How does this information help shape the stories that your local newspaper expends its resources covering? You also need to know who your audience is. Understand their demographics. For example, we have data to show us who goes in depth on breaking news and regular news. Are your readers mostly millennials, retired, a mix? Now, your publication should be doing periodic reader surveys to find out the demographics of your readers. Here's another example of how knowing the demographics of your audience can help determine where you spend your time and resources. From this Pew Research Center data, we can see what topics readers are interested in based on their age. Notice, however, that there are some topics that transcend age and are followed by more than 50% of people in all age groups. Do more men read your newspaper than women? Or do about the same number of men and women read your publication? Knowing the gender makeup of your audience can also help you determine what topics your readers will want to read. If you're interested in the type of research into journalism and media that the Pew Research Center conducts, visit www.journalism.org. And if you have any questions about today's topic, please post in the discussion area on eCourseWare so that everyone can benefit.